Yeah.
Okay, cool. I will hit the go live button now. And James, whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Our speaker tonight is Lieutenant Kishan Patel. Lieutenant Patel is a cyberspace operations officer in the U.S. Space Force and a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy, where he competed as part of the Air Force's cyber warfare competition team. Lieutenant Patel currently serves as the Chief of Cybersecurity for the Global Positioning System and is joining us tonight from Colorado Springs, Colorado. Thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us tonight.
Yeah, thank you, James. Thanks for having me. Just want to start with a disclaimer that any views I express today are of my own. I'm not here on an official capacity. But on that note, let's start. I wanted to format this talk in a way that where you guys can ask me questions and interrupt, so feel free to do that, just raise a hand. The way I'm going to talk is first explain the vulnerabilities of GPS, how many things it affects, and then move on to why these vulnerabilities may be concerning, why they may be exploited, etc. And then go on to what potential fixes we have and what the future is for GPS, right? And where it stands in the global domain. So I wanted to start you guys off with a scenario that may not be all that hypothetical, right? It happened back in 2017. Imagine that you're a captain of a ship, a multi-million-dollar massive tanker, right? An oil tanker or a cargo tanker. In this case, it's a cargo tanker, and you're going through the Strait of the Indian Ocean, and oftentimes the ship is cruise controlled, right? There's no one controlling it. So you have the ship going on itself, and everything is going fine. You're crossing through the South Africa. You're coming around towards Europe. You go, and your ship gets taken control of, right, by pirates. What pirates did in this case back in 2017 was on a little raft. They came up really, really close to the boat, and using just $20 pieces of parts, they ordered off the internet, jammed the ship's GPS, right? They spoofed it to make it go left 2 degrees for the last several hours of the ship's mission, making it go off course into that country's territorial waters, taking control of the ship. This may seem like a one-off scenario, but it happens more and more often. And the reason why is because GPS is extremely easy to take control of, right? When most people think of GPS, they think of like Google Maps or Apple Maps or navigation in a car, but it extends much, much further than that. The Department of Homeland Security estimates that all 16 critical sectors of the United States are affected by GPS and are vulnerable to it going down. A London economic study found that GPS, if it goes down for 5 days, the UK economy will suffer a loss of $5.2 billion, right? So you may be wondering, sure, $5.2 billion lost per 5 days, 16 critical sectors in the United States, all affected by GPS. What does Google Maps have to do with that? What does navigation have to do with that? Navigation does play a role, but the biggest aspect of GPS, right, in a global security sense, it's its timing capabilities. GPS sets the world's clock. It sets the clock of every single device that's connected to any sort of accurate timekeeping measurement system. So the stock market relies on time from GPS to validate transactions. Airports rely on GPS to time where the planes are, what time they're landing, and plane management. Electrical grids use GPS to manage the grid's energy fluxes. Cell phone networks use GPS to validate and certify phone calls. Banks and ATMs use GPS to figure out what time transactions take place, manage all those transactions, and also keep physical security of ATMs, right? So if you move an ATM out of its place, it stops working. Ships use, as we discussed earlier, ships use GPS for navigation and timing, right? GPS pretty single-handedly allowed ships to efficiently navigate at night, right? They used to use celestial timing, the stars, but that wouldn't really work if it was cloudy. SSL uses GPS, and that's the big one, right? So whenever you send an encrypted text message over WhatsApp or use an encrypted email service, do a secure transaction over Amazon, that all requires something called an SSL certificate, right? Which is given to you on a 24-hour basis. And if that time is messed with, then your SSL certificate expires, and all of a sudden you won't be able to send encrypted emails, your encrypted WhatsApps, encrypted bank transactions, all that will shut down the GPS if GPS is jammed, right? So you could see how all these different segments, all these things we take for granted, are all dependent on GPS. You could think of it as if all your eggs are in one basket. I wanted to quickly go through two scenarios of how GPS is vulnerable to foreign malicious actors, if you can entertain me for a moment, right? So regarding the financial sector, in New Jersey, in like the barren swamplands in New Jersey, just 2 miles away from the MetLife Stadium, there's a building called the Equinox Data Center. The Equinox Data Center processes all the transactional information for Wall Street. So it handles all the New York Stock Exchange transactions as well as 39 other stock exchange and banks transactions. So the Equinox Center, every single transaction that happens on Wall Street goes to Equinox Center, gets settled there, and passed out throughout the country, right? So if I'm sitting in Colorado Springs and I like trade a stock or something, that's the signal is going to be sent through the Equinox Center, most likely. And the servers that certify the timestamps on those transactions use GPS timing to verify it, right? So if a trader on here sells at a certain time and I buy it on a certain time, those timelines should match. If they don't match, the transaction's invalid and won't go through. Well, imagine that if someone's just sitting in a hotel room, even a couple miles away from Equinox Center, right? They're just sitting in a hotel room. They've ordered $100 worth of parts off of Amazon or eBay or whatever, put together a janky little RF transmitter and go online, and they could download the code they need. It's all open source to run a GPS jammer. And if they press run and jam the GPS at the Equinox Center, the financial markets can potentially be disrupted. So that's the finance sector. Going into power, all over the US and the UK, and pretty much any other country that has a distributed centralized electrical grid, you have electrical substations that manage electricity for subgrids, right? So if you have like an urban area, so like the greater Dallas area, or the greater Colorado Springs area, or the greater London area or whatever, the power in those grids are usually handled by a single substation that manages which parts of town gets more energy as energy demand rises or decreases. There is something called a phaser measurement unit that measures the status of the grid, right? It's a physical unit. It's a big server rack inside the towers that manages, oh, this house needs more energy, or this sector of the town needs more energy, right? It sends messages back using GPS time-stamped clocks. If those timestamps gets disrupted, then according to a 2017 NIST report, those timestamps being disrupted can take generators offline because they could show that, oh, it doesn't need that much power anymore. You could start taking generators offline, significantly reducing the risk of your power, making it possible for the whole grid to come down, right? Just from someone sitting near a tower or far away, pointing a little antenna at the tower, using code they downloaded from the internet and $20 parts they ordered off of Amazon to bring down the electrical grid in that area. So hopefully that lets you see how integral GPS is to national security, to our critical infrastructure systems, and just like our way of life, right? So the next question would be, why would people want to disrupt GPS? What benefit is there to that? Oh, and before I mention that, I'm sure you guys know that there's, so GPS is an American enterprise, right, run by the military. The European Union has its own Galileo, Russia has GLaSSNAS, and China has Baidu. Japan and India is also working on their local GPS systems, but the thing is that they all run on the exact same frequency, right? So jamming one, taking down one of them, spoofing one of them will spoof all of them, right? So you get total satellite GPS or position PNT denial. So anything that affects one of them will affect all of them, right? But it's more than that. If you think about the fact that the GPS is controlled by the U.S. military, it could be used as an arm for U.S. military interest. Back in 1993, the U.S. denied the Chinese military access to GPS when they were when they were having an escalated conflict in the Strait of Taiwan. In 1998, the U.S. government shut down GPS over the country of India right? So a lot of countries started seeing like, oh, we shouldn't be reliant on GPS because the United States can just shut it off for us anytime. So China, Russia, the European Union, India, Japan are all been started developing their own GPS like systems, right? And they're pretty much the exact same thing for the most part. China's a bit different, but I'll get into that. The way GPS works is that there's around 40 satellites in the sky, and they just beam down time. That's all they do. They just say like, hey, I'm satellite number 45, and here's the time here with a little bit more data, right? It's a one-way passive system. And you need 4 of them to figure out where you are in the world. And since they're all on the same frequency and use pretty much the same protocol, it's easy to manufacture chips that can talk to multiple satellites at once, right? In fact, if you have a smartphone in your pocket and you're not from the US, there's a really good chance that your phone can take in input data from both GPS and Galileo, maybe even GLaSSNOS or Baidu too. And it's 2019. This is the age of the new power struggle, right? There's a vying influence for more and more, regional influence, right? China is trying to exert their influence, challenge United States hegemony. Russia is trying to decrease their dependence on U.S. enterprises, and so is the European Union, right? But one thing to note, right? One very interesting aspect of this is how China is using their Baidu system as a challenge to U.S. GPS hegemony. So they recently just completed their constellation. They have 55 satellites in the sky, and they've cleverly deployed Baidu so they have more satellites overhead and the capitals of many of their neighboring countries than there are GPS satellites, making their system more accurate than GPS, encouraging people to switch over to Baidu, right? And their Baidu system is part of their Information Belt and Road Initiative, right? So China has this multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, and one segment of that probably you don't hear about very often is the Information Belt and Road Initiative. It comes with 2 pillars. There's the 5G pillar, and then there's the PNT pillar. Baidu is part of the PNT pillar. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to sell PNT infrastructure all across their partners throughout the region, countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, African countries, etc., the ones that they already have existing 5G deals in, to encourage those countries to start using Baidu as opposed to GPS to exert their influence, right? Just recently in 2017, they signed a $2.3 billion deal with Thailand to get the country to start using Baidu alongside with GPS. So there's a significant push from China to start using GPS in those countries, and they're trying to do that for 2 reasons. One, it allows them to apply soft power over those countries, right? If a country uses your GPS system, you could take that system away anytime, and also it kind of forms good relationships with those countries. The other one is the fact that the Chinese Baidu system is unlike every other global positioning system, PNT system out there, right? So GPS, Galileo, GLaSSNOS, all those are passive. They just beep down, and your phone, using the little beeps, will figure out where you are in the world, and that's it. That's where it ends, with you figuring out where you are. The Chinese Baidu system is a 2-way street, right? So it'll beep down your location to your phone, and your phone will ping back up to the satellites where it is, right? With your phone's specific ID. And that presents a pretty significant security risk, which is why the US government has been heavily restricting the use of Baidu in the United States, because it allows the operators of Baidu to potentially get information of where these devices are. But it extends even further than that, right? So if you think about it in the sense that China has great control over its foreign domestic markets, right? Just this year, they've started requiring that all Chinese phones built or manufactured in China, in the mainland, use Baidu as well as the other GPS, GLaSSNOS, and the Russian systems. So all Chinese manufactured phones like Huawei, Xiaomi will have Baidu receivers in them, which seems like an obvious step forward. If your country develops a PNT ability, that their domestic products will also have PNT receiving capabilities. But one thing that may surprise many is the fact that China is the largest manufacturer of phones in Africa. Almost every African phone is manufactured in China, and Africa has more phones than the European Union does, right? So just using Chinese phones with access to Baidu in Africa gives Chinese significant leverage over those countries, as well as their 5G network. So it's a combination of those two pillars of their information Belt and Road initiative. It gives them significant soft power and expands their bubble of influence. So that's kind of like how the geopolitical game is played between the powers of PNT. Going forward into what is the United States doing about it, right? So the big concerns are us being jammed and spoofed. And one thing that we've been doing, and it's almost completed, we're one satellite launch away, and it's going to be launched in July 2021 in a few months. They'll complete the constellation for it, is M-code. M-code is a special little technical ability that GPS will soon gain, which allows it to become much, much more difficult to being hacked and jammed and spoofed, right? So once that's deployed, the military concerns of us losing GPS capabilities at least will be diminished. But unfortunately, it won't be distributed to the civilian sectors. It'll only be to the military sectors. But one thing that we're doing to increase our robustness to the military sectors, and it's also being implemented in the European Union, the UK, United States, Canada, and all of our other partners that are ground-based GPS receivers, right? Part of the reason why GPS is so easy to hack, spoof, and jam is because the constellation is really high up. It's in MEO, medium Earth orbit, much higher than the vast majority of satellites. And by the time the signal gets to the United States and the Earth's surface is really weak, the GPS signal is actually in the noise floor. If you were to turn on like your radio signal receiver, you wouldn't be able to see the GPS signals at all. So what we're doing is we're setting up towers all across the country. You don't really need very many. I think only 20 towers can cover the entire continental US. Those will be much closer to home and will provide a much louder signal, making it very difficult to jam, spoof, and hack GPS. But till then, it's still happening. But one potential step forward, which will provide even greater accuracy and jam proofing, is the Army proposal that SpaceX provide PNT capabilities, right? So SpaceX is currently working on their Starlink constellation. They already have 1,000 satellites in the sky. They're planning on putting many thousand more. If they all gain the same capabilities that GPS has, like the PNT capabilities, all of a sudden, rather than being beholden to like 6 or 7 satellites in the sky giving you capabilities, you could have potentially 30 satellites over you at any time, 30 satellites to triangulate your data to your location from, giving you pinpoint accuracy like you've never had before. And since they're in low Earth orbit, they're much louder, making it more difficult to mess with. So that's something to look forward to as well. There's a lot of challenges that GPS faces, right? And we do really depend on it in all of our sectors, and our whole way of life depends on this one technology. We're working on diversifying it and reducing risk, but it will take a while. Until then, we have to explore different venues, different operations, different options we have to reduce risk, and also play like the geopolitical game with our adversaries to ensure that the GPS stays safe and is protected. Any questions?
Great. Thank you so much for that, Kishan. That was a really insightful overview into some of the vulnerabilities concerning GPS today, but also a little bit into the policy proposals. So I think what we're going to do now is we're going to open up the floor to questions. So if you're on our call, I'd ask you to please use the raise hand function or to type into the chat box and we can read those out. And if you're joining us on YouTube, please feel free to type your question there as well, where we will read it and get it to Kishan. So I think James was going to start us off. I saw something in the chat. James, would you like to take the floor?
Hi, thank you so much for that. I was just wondering, are anti-satellite weapons a big concern of GPS, or are you more concerned about other threats?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I didn't mention that in my talk, but yeah, that's absolutely a concern, right? Because there's many ways to degrade our own GPS capabilities, and Antisat is one of them. But it's not really all that big of a concern for us because there's much, much easier ways to pose a threat to GPS, right? So GPS runs off of 4 ground stations scattered throughout the world. They're just on tiny Pacific islands, some in the Atlantic, some in the Pacific. Just a cloudy day over a small island off the coast of Sri Lanka called Diego Garcia can cause problems for us, right? And our adversaries know that. So it's really expensive. It costs millions of dollars to launch an anti-sat missile into the sky, into MEO especially, right? But it's much cheaper to hit us in our soft underbelly on the ground. And that's where we're trying to patch up our vulnerabilities.
Great. So I see a question from Matthew. Would you like to go ahead?
Yeah. The pivot more physical attacks to cyber attack concerns. I'm curious how much your office was brought in for things like Hackasat with Will Roper, big focus on satellite security. Was this something that a lot of the GPS people were brought into, or was it just sort of developed separately?
No, it was. We were part of all of that stuff. For the most recent Hackasat, our own GPS cyber defense team played a big role as one of the admins for the competition as the red team, right? They had several red teams for the competition, and we played a good role in that. We've been really keen on our cyber vulnerabilities. Luckily, we don't have too many, simply because of the way our system is built. But the threat is always persistent, right? It's like a game of whack-a-mole. And my office deals heavily with just examining, here's our network, here's the possible ways they can come in, here's the ways that it's vulnerable, and trying to patch as many of those as possible. And it seems like every single day there is more news of more vulnerabilities coming out, and we're trying to patch them. And the reason why we participate in competitions like Hackasat is we're trying to see what all these brilliant people are coming up with, all these different innovative ways of breaking a system. So as soon as they do it right, we can quickly fix it to make sure that doesn't become a real attack vector in the future.
Thank you. So we've got a question sent in here that's asking why the US gives GPS for free. So do you think you could elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I forgot the year. I think it was before 2008. If I remember correctly, it was 1998. There is a passenger airline flying really close to North Korean airspace, and it got shot down and caused massive outrage. And the reason why it happened was because since they didn't have any accurate way to navigate, right? Back in the days, you kind of just had to use a compass and the stars and the ground to kind of figure out where you were. They strayed into North Korean territory and got shot down. And at the time, the US realized that they had the capabilities to prevent this from ever happening again, right? They were like, we have GPS. GPS can tell people accurately where people are in the world. If we open this technology up, an accident like this will hopefully never happen again. So that was the motivation to opening up GPS to the commercial segment, and it ended up being a really, really, really good decision on our part, because GPS we're allowed to create all these different industries that wouldn't have existed before. I think the economic impact is like $1.2 trillion over the course of the lifetime of the system. So it's worked out really well for us so far.
Absolutely. Thank you. I see a hand from Anna. Would you like to go ahead?
Thank you so much, and thank you for your talk as well. So I was wondering, you mentioned before that the different systems of different countries work on the same frequency, and so one thing that might perturb the US GPS could also affect all the other countries. And so I was wondering, do you see any collaboration maybe between countries to prevent those kind of attacks?
Yeah, so regarding like how they're interconnected, it actually goes further than that. The Indian and the Japanese systems are just augments to GPS. They work with it. The Galileo and the GLaSSNOT systems are independent, but they work with pretty much the same protocol and on the same frequency, so they're heavily related. I don't see the countries working together because once they work together, right, it kind of takes away like the independent advantage they have. But but they do all work together in the sense that they don't want their satellites colliding. So we work out different agreements on where the satellites, what orbits they should be placed in. We work on agreements on how those, even though we use the same frequency, how it's shared. The GPS and Galileo, the EU's system has been working together to provide one chip that would have both of those systems on it, giving us greater accuracy. So in those ways, we're working together, but I don't see a potential collaboration between the US, EU, and China. Oh, and also the same kind of bilateral agreement that the EU and the United States has, China and Russia has as well. So the same receivers that could pick up GLaSSNOT can also pick up Baidu.
Thank you so much. We have another question. Yeah. So Miriam, would you like to speak? I see your hand, and then I'll read out the question after.
Thank you. So you've gone into detail on China's GPS policy and how it's using it for soft power purposes. I'd be interested to hear more on Russia's GPS system and how they're using it.
Yeah, so Russia's GPS system was started in the Cold War, like right on the heels of ours, but they're not using it anything like China's, right? China is using their GPS system as a means of pushing their power forward, right, to expand their sphere of influence. Russia is using their GPS system or their GLaSSNOT system as a means of breaking away from American dependence, right? So that their weapon systems, their guided munition bombs, their critical infrastructure isn't dependent on the U.S. military deciding whether or not they want to stop those services over the country of Russia, right? So for them, it's more like a defensive tool, and for China, it's more of like a policy forward-facing tool.
Thank you very much. So circling back quickly to the question that we just had before, we had one that was sent in that I think is building off that a little bit. And it's asking kind of about why Europe has their own constellation instead of collaborating with the US, which I think is getting a little bit at this kind of worry about dependency. So I was wondering if you could explore that a bit more.
Yeah, so I think it's a great thing that we have two separate trustable, reliable GPS constellations. And I know the Galileo, the EU's constellation, is actually more accurate than our GPS constellation. Too. The fact that it's separate would mean that if one goes down, we still have the other one. It just adds a level of redundancy. There's a great level of trust between the EU and the United States. So it's not a distrust type of deal. It just seems, I think the deal kind of progressed, kind of sprang forth from the idea that we just want to future-proof. We want to have a robust, independent, redundant system in case anything happens in the future. With GPS, we still have our own system. And from the U.S. perspective, that's great for us, right? Because the more redundancy there is in the system, the more trustable redundancy there is, the more secure our own system becomes.
Thank you. And I think kind of building off of that from the other side, we have a question that was sent in that's asked about if there's any increased hacking risk, kind of that you mentioned before, linked to the usage of identical frequencies by all the satellites. So I know you were just explaining there some of the positive sides, but maybe you could delve into some of the negatives of that as well.
Yeah, no. So whenever I mention hacking, I don't mean hacking the satellites. That's almost impossible to do. When I say hacking, I use that as an inclusive term to reference spoofing and jamming both together. And yeah, absolutely. Since they all use the same frequency, the likelihood of being jammed and spoofed is very high. The problem is that risk is only relevant in countries other than China and Russia, and there's a couple more countries, but I can't think of them. It's like 4 countries. China and Russia has ground station receivers, which makes jamming and spoofing their satellite systems very, very difficult, right? Not the case in the United States and the EU. It's really easy to jam and spoof there. So it is a concern, but it's more a regional concern. It's a concern for us. It's a concern for our EU partners and a lot of countries around the globe, but not so much for our adversaries. If you spoof or jam GPS there, sure, you could knock out signals coming from the satellites to the receivers, but it's going to be really difficult to jam the signals coming from the ground receivers to the terminals. And hopefully, as we keep building our domestic ground satellite network, those vulnerabilities of jamming and spoofing will go away.
Yeah, completely. Thank you. So I think we've got another question sent in here that's looking a little bit more, I guess, at the satellites themselves. So the question reads, how long can we expect one satellite to stay functional? Are there any plans to repair or recycle defunct satellites in the future to extend their lifespan?
Yeah, no. So in our constellation, we need 25 satellites to be operational to give a signal, right? We have 31 up there, and we have 7 in reserve in case something happens to the other ones, and they're like end of life cycle, the ones that go out, right? So typically they last 10 years. The newest block of satellites, they last 15 years. They're pretty self-sustaining, and whenever they get old, we kind of deorbit them and burn them up to produce less space junk. We're constantly launching up new satellites to replenish the old one with new features and new capabilities. For example, the new satellites that we're launching, the GPS Block 3, we've already launched 4 of them. We're launching our 5th one in July. They have greater functionality. They have something called search and rescue. So if someone I don't know too much of the details of how it works, but essentially allow people to find distress beacons. So say a ship is in trouble, it could release a distress beacon, and the satellite can pick up the distress beacon and get help to them, right? So that's just kind of like the iterative upgrades we're doing to the satellites. Hopefully over time we could add more and more functionality. One thing that a lot of people don't know is that the GPS satellites don't just provide PNT, position, navigation, and timing. They also provide nuclear detection. So if any time a nuclear bomb goes off anywhere in the world, the GPS satellites can detect where it's coming from and send that signal back down as well.
Thank you so much. So our next question is going to come from Andy. Andy, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hello there. Thank you so much for your fascinating insights. 2 quick questions, if I may. The first one is just a light-hearted question, and that is thinking back to, I'm thinking Tomorrow Never, World Is Not Enough. No, Tomorrow Never Dies, 1997 James Bond film. So that's 1997. That's over 20 years ago, where they one of the plot devices was GPS spoofing. And by the sounds of your description, they showed a very advanced technological device. Maybe that was completely unnecessary, and they could have saved a bunch of money by just getting $20 parts. But the light-hearted question is, can you think of any portrayals in fiction of GPS hacking where you're just shaking your head and laughing and thinking, oh, that'll never happen, thank heavens for that? But then the more serious question, it comes back to Baidu. And I was wondering if are there any technical reasons or advantages for this two-way communication that the Baidu system has, or is the return ping, is that hard to see as anything other than an information collecting device? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Regarding your first half, or if I've seen it in the movies portrayed incorrectly, unfortunately not. The only movie that I could think of is Die Hard 2, where they take over the airports and change the heading of the planes to make it crash into the ground. That seemed very realistic, very possible. It's the simple fact that since this is so simple, it's such a simple technology, right? It's easy to kind of portray in a realistic manner. And that should be frightening, right? That should be one of the things that we keep in that's something that my squadron keeps in the front of its mind when we're developing this system and we're operating it. How can we reduce risk of this happening, and etc. Regarding the second part about the two-way communication, I think it presents the constellation with a lot of benefits, right? Imagine if not only can you get your data location, but you could also send messages back up. Think of the ways your phone currently requires you to send messages back up, right? to the world. You have to use cell towers. You have to use the internet, right? What if you don't have either? What if you don't have cell towers or the internet and you need to send a distress signal? More likely than not, you'll always have GPS satellites or Baidu satellites over your head, right? And you could always send that distress signal. You could always send status updates if you need some, if you like, you know, are going into a dangerous area and you want your friends and family to know where you are. You could set that up so they sends your location to them. It adds a lot of great capabilities too, but at a great cost as well. One thing to think about is like when we say that like sure this can be used for spying or it's the negative aspects. Those are just, you know, us speculating. We don't really know what it's being used for. China says it's used for search and rescue, right? It's used for status checking. It's used for and that's a great, you know, counterweight on the scale. But as you know, users of their adversarial country, right, us, we should be hesitant. Since China's requiring that all domestic phones use Baidu, and those domestic phones are also sold in the US, UK, and European markets, we should be careful as consumers and understand that these phones can call home, right, back to their main countries.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I might push you a little bit on the very last bit of the question there in terms of some of the potentially long-term impacts of this two-way communication that you were talking about with the Chinese satellite system. What do you see as potentially some of those long-term negative impacts, for example, on individual citizens' privacy or security if this were to become the norm? Even just in China or indeed in other satellite systems?
Yeah, no, absolutely. First, I just want to mention something that is an implication of the fact that it's a two-way communication. So on your phone, right? So you have like an airplane mode, right, where you could turn off communication with cell towers. So whenever most people turn on airplane mode, it prevents communication with cell towers. You can't talk to cell towers. No more radio signals coming out of your phone towards cell towers. GPS is passive. It's still listening to GPS signals, right? So at least on iPhones, airplane mode will stop radio signals from going out, but signals will still come in. But that's just how Apple implements it, right? What's stopping other phone manufacturers from implementing an airplane mode or a turn off cellular switch or something on their phone that prevents users from accessing cellular networks on purpose, right? So then gives users a perceived idea of them being safe and secure. But in reality, it's really difficult, and there's no software way to turn off your connection to the GPS satellites or the Baidu satellites, etc. So even if you're like a user of a Chinese-made phone or a phone from another manufacturer that uses Baidu for PNT purposes, will there be a way to turn off talking to those satellites since it's a two-way street? Currently, there isn't. Maybe that's something that should be considered in the future. But that's one like security, safety, privacy implication of the two-way street, right? That you may not be able to stop the two-way communication because it's constantly happening in the background. Regarding moving forward, I find it highly unlikely that the other countries will implement the two-way communication system simply because these satellites are extremely expensive to maintain and to build, etc. And they operate within a very narrow like mission statement margin, right? So whenever GPS was built, right, it came with Congress gave a mission statement, and we built a system around it. And the mission statement was to provide accurate position, navigation, timing to the world, right? Not the other way around. Unless the mission statements are changed, no, I don't imagine these countries, us included, spending billions of dollars to develop the capabilities for a two-way street and then updating every single phone modem to allow two-way communication, especially because two-way communication is already possible. Your phone talks back and forth with cell towers, and that presents its own privacy challenges. If you guys want to like explore more about that, Google the Italian CIA cell tower. Just Google those keywords and just look at the links that come up.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think I saw a hand from Graham. Graham, did you have a question you wanted to ask? I think you may be muted right now, Graham.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Well, could you give any timescale for any strategic exchanges of equipment in terms of, you say you give a life for satellites, but I mean, what sort of timescale are we thinking of in terms of a generation change?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So generation change. So far, we're on our third generation or fourth generation of GPS satellites. GPS has been operating for 40 years, so that gives us a generation turnaround for 10 years. So every 10 years, we come up with a new generation of GPS satellites. I don't know what it's like for the other constellations because they're just simply so new. Baidu just came online last year, and Glassnose came on the year before that. So for generationally, each generation comes with more and more features, updates. For example, the newest generation of GPS satellites, GPS 3, has 8 times greater security, 5 times greater accuracy, etc. Right. So every generation gets better and better, but the inherent flaw of the fact that the satellites are in medium Earth orbit will make it so that the signal will always be very weak. So to really add robustness to our system, it's not the solution isn't necessarily satellites, but rather putting antennas on the ground to give GPS position, navigation, timing across the world.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from Matthew, if you'd like to go ahead. Okay, potentially an internet issue from Matthew. We're going to pass to Andy then, and then Matthew will come after if there's that reconnection.
Give Matthew a chance. Very good. Yes, just another question, if I may. Coming back to basically the strategic implications that GPS brings, do you have a view on the soft power benefits that it has brought the US over these past, as you say, decades? Because obviously being the first system and the only system for a long time, there was a benefit through in soft power. Although a specific benefit, for instance, what abilities did it, or bargaining positions did it give, for instance, the United States government? Because you've got the power to switch it off. But then are there other things you can do? It's not like it's tiered and you can say, oh, we really like you, we're going to give you access to GPS Plus or anything like that.
No, it is exactly like that.
Oh, very good. Oh, even better. Well, in which case, that'll be fascinating to hear. But then also moving forwards, because I say now, with people multiplying the constellations for perhaps other reasons, as you're saying, redundancy, independence, etc., is the soft power benefit now just indeed just being diluted if it was really, really there in the first bit, which it was? Thank you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's an amazing observation, right? So I wouldn't even call it soft power. I might even go as far as to call it hard power, right? Initially, back in like the 1990s to the 2005-ish time frame, because the United States has the capability to turn off countries' GPSs, right? Regionally, just turn off all GPS access. We could stop. For example, I mentioned the conflict in the Taiwan Strait back in 1993. The U.S. government shut off GPS in those areas, so all of China's GPS-guided munitions just fell into the ocean. Right, they were useless, which kind of sparked off on them creating their own capability. It gave us massive bargaining power because anytime a country led an operation that we didn't agree with, and if it was extreme enough, the United States would periodically just turn off GPS in those regions, and now those countries wouldn't have access to the capabilities that we provide. So that was kind of like how we gave the hard/soft power, and you're absolutely right. It does get diluted as countries start developing their own, and that's precisely the reason why countries are developing their own. Right? They're trying to challenge American soft power, especially China. Regarding GPS Plus, that is absolutely something that exists. Right? there's two bands that GPS frequency that we're on, and every constellation uses these two bands. It's not just special to us. There's L2 and L5. L2 is what civilians use, and it's pretty accurate and it's very fast, very reliable, right? So if you like pull up your phone, your phone will instantly connect to the satellites. L5 takes longer for it to connect, but it's harder to jam and it's significantly more accurate, right? And we can control exactly where L5 is. So L2 gives pretty like good uniform global coverage. L5, since it's a higher frequency, it doesn't have great global coverage, but we could kind of pinpoint the spots on Earth where we want the L5 band speed, give greater like coverage, greater accuracy to. So anytime our partners are doing exercises or something, or our own warfighters are doing exercises, they can request like, hey, we want greater GPS abilities in these areas, and we'll kind of shift the satellites around to give greater access, greater accuracy in those areas for our partners.
Thank you so much. I think Matthew is back and with the connection. So Matthew, would you like to go ahead?
I mean, we'll see. That might be cursed to say, but in terms of satellite cybersecurity itself, rather than focusing on the ground systems, what's to make satellites different from more of I mean, admittedly difficult, but traditional hacking problem of, somebody gets into the dev environment, is able to, if you're able to push any firmware changes or any software updates to the satellites, then it's more of a much more traditional cybersecurity problem than necessarily something like a supply chain attack, which is limited to more nation state actors. What's to prevent that sort of thing from occurring?
Oh, well, hopefully the answer is my office, but it's a persistent challenge, right? When it comes to hacking satellites, most of this it's an opportunity cost thing, right? The hackers will go towards the venue, the method of attack that's the easiest to them, like the most cost efficient, the most like effort intensive. The hardest way to hack a satellite is going like shooting your own little satellite up to the sky, flying it really close to our satellite, just collecting information. One thing that people don't realize is that satellite communication is encrypted, right? So the communications from the ground stations to the sats, super encrypted, more encrypted than anything else you could possibly encrypt. But the communications between the components on the satellites are all unencrypted, right? So like say you have one module here, another module here, and you have a wire connecting them. When data is being passed, that wire acts like an antenna beaming out what's being said on that satellite out into space, albeit a very weak signal. But if you could bring your own little satellite close to it, you could listen to what is being said and potentially eavesdrop on everything that's happening on that satellite. But that's really hard to do. It requires a lot of money and a lot of prerequisites to get to that point. So what's more likely for hackers to do is, since these ground systems for satellites are so massive, it's huge. GPS has over 20 different tracking stations that we could potentially use, right? Try to interdict on some of the communication routes. They can use more traditional means of hacking. Our GPS system is air gapped, right? So it's not connected to the external network, etc. So you can't employ normal network infiltration methods that are typically used in the cybersecurity space. But given that most of our adversaries are nation states, the threat is definitely there, and they're coming up with more creative and new ways on a daily basis. And we meet them with our own expertise to try to mitigate that.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. So we've got another question here that was sent in that reads, do you know if any significant shift in the risks or the tech associated with the launch of CubeSat network to lunar orbit for the Artemis program, or do you know of any, significant shift? And does the military have a strategic interest here?
You're muted.
Oh, Kishan, I think you might be muted.
Or jammed.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah, we can.
Perfect. Yeah, I don't know too much about the Artemis program and about moon orbits and stuff like that. But CubeSats does present like a new risk that didn't exist beforehand, right? There was a experiment conducted last year, back in 2020. It was like early 2020 or late 2019. I don't remember, where a government agency like launched a CubeSat up into orbit with a GPS jammer or RF jammers. They could jam more than just GPS. Pointed upwards, right? Pointed right up at the satellites. And it's in low Earth orbit. So as it's orbiting Earth, right, it's pointing its jammers up, jamming the satellites' receivers themselves, making it so the satellites can't talk to their ground stations. And that presents a huge risk for us, right? Especially because it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to launch these mini CubeSats. And rather than it being in the past where it would be like a multi-million dollar, like $500 million to launch this crazy cutting edge 10 years of development satellite in the sky to jam or do ASAT stuff. Now all you have to do is a couple of $100,000 CubeSat, grab a couple of $10,000 ride-sharing rocket launch and shoot your rocket up there. And now you have ASAT capabilities.
Thank you so much. I'd like to shift gears a little bit into a bit of a policy question, if that's all right. So you mentioned during your talk about some improvements that are being made currently to military infrastructure to secure it that will hopefully be completed later this year. But I was wondering if we could circle back a little bit to the civilian side, because I know there has been a similar problem in the past, for example, with cybersecurity. For example, in 2007 in Estonia with attacks on the civilian side. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what can be done to protect some of the civilian infrastructure regarding GPS and satellites in general, or even what is in the works if that's happening too, and it's just not being discussed at the same level that the military infrastructure is. Thank you.
Yeah, so the solution there is also one the military is developing, right? Because all the spoofing and jamming, right, that comes from position navigation and timing degradation comes from the fact that the signal is just weak, right? So what I mentioned earlier about the ground stations being built will be open and accessible to the public. In fact, the civilians will be the largest users of these ground stations. And it'll pretty much make jamming and spoofing non-existent. It'll make it extremely difficult to do, very power intensive, right? And only possible over a very small range. Unlike the U.S., like a Navy carrier group back in 2019, jamming the entire eastern seaboard of the United States from just one ship, making that impossible to happen, right? Hopefully, like the development of these are accelerated, especially since you don't need too many towers, and we set them up all throughout our partner nations as well as the United States, making it significantly harder for our adversaries to do jamming attacks, right? And you bring a really good point up with Estonia, especially that whole region with Ukraine. One of the most preferred methods of disrupting their enemies in that area from an adversary, Russia, for example, is to just jam GPS. There's whole portions of Ukraine that are being jammed to GPS to make it significantly harder to do day-to-day, like, life of a civilian, all the way to operations for the military people there. So if we can put those ground stations up, and there are talks of putting a lot of ground stations up, and in the US, they've already started building them, will hopefully make those methods of attack non-existent.
Thank you so much. We're coming up on the end of the hour here, so I'm going to put in a call for last questions. So if you have any last questions, put your hand up, put them in the chat. I see a hand right now from Al. So Al, if you'd like to go ahead.
Hi there. Yeah, I've got 2 questions for you, and also thank you very much for a very interesting talk. The idea of the towers in order to create redundancy seems incredibly sensible considering the vulnerabilities you've described. What sort of timeline before they come on? Because obviously that then denotes a window in which you don't have that redundancy. Do you know what sort of time frame we're looking at for a rollout?
Are you referring to the ground stations?
Yes.
Yeah, so U.S. Congress passed a law in 2016 or 2006 requiring us to have it. It's 2021, right? It took a really, really long time to work out all the details. There's a lot of pushback, a lot of bureaucracy there, but it seems like we're finally, getting past it, and just started in December 2020. So we're just in the early stages of starting to build out this infrastructure. it shouldn't take all that long, right? Since we're only putting up 20-ish towers in the continental U.S. and in our partner nations, it should take a little bit longer because there's just a little bit more negotiations to be done there. I expect 5 years, right? And I know that sounds like a long time scale, but in military terms, that's tomorrow. So hopefully within that time frame, we're able to deploy this redundance measure, making GPS a lot more robust, making Galileo a lot more robust to prevent hacking and spoofing from happening.
Okay, thank you. And the other question I've got relates to time again, in the sense that a lot of the satellites obviously were created quite a long time ago, and one of the nefarious attacks that we've seen sort of play more recently is component-based installation of virus risks, where it does, you had instances where I think the FBI did a sweep of shelves in Washington and just pulled PCs off the racks and discovered that the chips in some of those had been effectively delivered as bulk options already compromised. So I'm just wondering how much of that sort of stuff has been considered in terms of previous builds and things you may have adopted already as risks.
Oh, you are like dead on about supply chain attacks. That's come to light in the last few years to the U.S. and we're like doubling down. We're giving great attention to our supply chains, especially after some events. Regarding like satellites themselves, most of those components for satellites are like manufactured in the U.S. on site specifically for the satellites, unlike computers where you would get the hard drive from Thailand, and there's a lot of points of interdiction there as the ship's coming from Thailand to the United States to get assembled. If it's being assembled in the U.S., most of the time it's being assembled in Taiwan or South Korea. There's a lot more chance for computer components to be interdicted in the supply chain. It's much harder for satellites. All our GPS satellites are made here in Denver, Colorado, in the middle of the country in one building. Every component is built there. We have a lot of people on site doing quality assurance, and there's a lot of accountability there. Every single piece, every nut and bolt is inspected and has its supply chain routed. So the chances of a supply chain attack happening on a satellite, or at least our GPS satellites, are low. I can't really speak for like the CubeSats or the sats that the private industry makes.
To be honest, I didn't know whether you'd be able to answer that question, and the fact you have is really reassuring. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're going to have our final question from Anna before we move to our wrap-up. So Anna, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you very much. I just have a follow-up question on something you mentioned before about there being agreements and treaties between countries kind of regulating their use of outer space. And I was wondering how broad these agreements are and kind of what is the broadest that they would cover, and also how do private companies like SpaceX fit into these kind of agreements?
Got it. So those agreements, one thing to note, are between governments of countries, right? And agreement is it's just a promise. The main thing here, right, at least from the GPS perspective, is the idea of first come first serve, right? And that's kind of like the whole space industry runs on the first come first serve notion. Since America came in first, we get to say on how things are ran, right? Since we deploy GPS first at the specific frequency that's best for doing GPS, doing position, navigation, timing, we get to own it. It wasn't until 2017 China got permission from us to use it, right? So it does follow the first come first serve idea. Is that sustainable? Probably not, right? It only works since we're the dominant power at the moment, but as that becomes more contested, it'll become a free-for-all. Regarding spectrum, that one has to be closely worked on between the countries, because just someone operating the wrong spectrum can push everyone offline. So I expect those treaties to be held more closely than treaties that dictate what orbit people are in. Regarding private companies like SpaceX, they aren't part of those treaties, right? There's one little part of space law that a lot of people don't realize, is that the country that their companies are located they're not liable for anything that happens in space. It's the countries that are liable. So if SpaceX goes up to space and I don't know, hits another satellite from another country, SpaceX isn't the company that's liable. It's the United States that's liable, since the rockets are being launched out of the United States and it's an American company, right? So the way they fit into these treaties is that the United States is just a proxy to them, and the United States completely controls all their operations, right? Because they're liable to all of them. So the SpaceX can only do as much as the U.S. allows them to do. And that's part of the treaties as well. And that applies to every country. Like Russian satellite companies can only do as much as Russia allows them to, because Russia, at the end of the day, is the one that foots the responsibility if anything happens in space.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Kishan, for that really thought-provoking discussion that you've led for us tonight on the pretty complex issue that is satellites and their usage today. And thank you, as always, to our members and viewers for the really excellent questions that you've posed. Kishan, do you have any final comments that you'd like to make tonight before we wrap up?
No, I'm just glad to see everyone here today. This topic is really complex, but it affects a lot of people. It touches every aspect of our daily life, right? And it's it's important to understand the powers at play here and the vulnerabilities, so we can better protect ourselves and move forward into the future.
Absolutely, I think that's really well said. Well, I think all that's left to do now is thank you one more time so much for sharing your time with us and all of your expertise. And for those of you that enjoyed tonight and you'd like to join us next week, we will be meeting same place, same time, where Professor Jeffrey DeBalco is going to be speaking to us about security. What's climate change got to do with it? And after this, for those of you that would like to stick around for 15, 20 minutes to just have an informal chat with the other members, discuss your thoughts on tonight's event, or any of the other events, or even learn more about getting involved with the committee for next year, please do stick around. But otherwise, see you next week. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.